It started as a moment no one thought twice about. A quiet recording, a farewell message meant only for family, spoken in the soft voice of someone who knew their time was short. It wasn't meant for strangers. It wasn't meant for the world. But fate has a way of turning private words into something much larger. That single goodbye, captured and preserved, would later echo in a courtroom, changing everything. The voice on the recording carried both sadness and strength. You could hear the weight of finality, the acceptance of leaving behind what couldn't be carried any longer. But you could also hear something else: truth. And truth has a way of cutting through lies, no matter how carefully they're built. At first, the recording was nothing more than a keepsake, a memory. Families hold on to these things to remind themselves of love that doesn't fade, of voices that shouldn't be forgotten. But the day would come when that memory became evidence, when a farewell turned into testimony, and when silence broke open the reality that someone had tried desperately to hide. Imagine sitting in a courtroom and hearing a voice that no longer exists in the living world. A voice that doesn't waver, doesn't hesitate, doesn't ask permission to be believed. There is no cross-examination, no trick to twist the words. There is only the undeniable truth, spoken by someone who knew this would be their last chance. That's the power of final words. They are unedited, raw, and free from the masks people wear in everyday life. And sometimes those words become the strongest evidence, stronger than documents, stronger than witnesses, because they come from the place beyond fear. This case, the one you're about to hear, isn't just about crime or justice. It's about the extraordinary way truth finds its way into the light, even when darkness tries to bury it. It's about a goodbye that was never supposed to be heard in a courtroom, but became the voice that could not be silenced. Before we go further, take a moment to join us here, because we bring you stories like this every day, stories that reveal how life can change in a single moment. Subscribe to our channel, not because it helps us grow, but because it ensures you never miss the truths hidden in the most unexpected places. The recording began simply. No drama, no performance, just words spoken into the quiet, words filled with emotion. But as those words played later, they exposed lies, shattered carefully built defenses, and left the courtroom in silence. The kind of silence that only comes when everyone realizes they've just heard something that cannot be ignored. That silence was the beginning of the end for someone who thought they had covered their tracks. And it was the start of justice for the one whose voice had returned one last time. That silence in the courtroom was not ordinary. It was the kind that makes every heartbeat sound louder, the kind that forces people to shift in their seats, unable to escape what they just heard. The defense had prepared pages of arguments, witnesses ready to testify, and strategies designed to raise doubt. But no strategy in the world could compete with the raw honesty of that recording. The words spoken weren't complicated. They weren't meant to prove guilt or innocence. They were simply real. "If you're hearing this," the voice said, "then I couldn't say goodbye in person. But I need you to know the truth before I'm gone." That single sentence froze the room, because in those words was not just farewell. It was a hand reaching out from the past, pointing directly at what had been hidden. You see, truth has a way of surviving even death. Lies need constant maintenance. They require rehearsals, reminders, and reinforcements. But truth doesn't. It stands on its own. And when the voice from that recording revealed details only the victim could have known, details no one could twist or deny, The carefully built wall of deception began to crack. Jurors leaned forward, listening not just with their ears, but with their entire being. This wasn't another witness whose memory could be challenged or a piece of evidence that could be dismissed as coincidence. This was the very person at the heart of it all, speaking beyond their last breath. And perhaps what made it most powerful was how unplanned it seemed. This wasn't recorded with the courtroom in mind. It wasn't crafted to win a case. It was simply someone's last attempt to leave behind clarity for the people they loved. Yet that very purity, that lack of agenda, made it impossible to ignore. The prosecution didn't even need to add much. They simply pressed play. Again and again, the words fell like heavy stones into the room, each one breaking apart the false stories that had been told. The defendant tried to remain calm, but there are moments when even the most practiced mask begins to slip, and as the voice carried on, everyone could see it. Guilt has a way of showing itself when confronted with truth that can't be argued against. What struck many who were there wasn't just the content of the message, but the tone. It wasn't angry, it wasn't vengeful, it was peaceful, almost gentle, as if the speaker knew that justice, in the end, doesn't need to be shouted. It only needs to be spoken once, clearly, and it will echo forever. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't divided into sides. It wasn't about the prosecution or the defense, the jury or the judge. It was about the undeniable fact that a final goodbye had become more powerful than anyone imagined. And it was only the beginning of what would follow. As the courtroom absorbed the weight of those words, something shifted. It was no longer a battle of arguments, no longer about which lawyer could outsmart the other. The focus turned entirely to the voice that had returned, a voice that spoke not with the intention of winning, but simply of being heard. For days, the trial had been filled with technical evidence, fingerprints, timelines, expert testimony. All of it mattered, but none of it had pierced the heart of the case quite like this. The recording transformed the atmosphere. Jurors began to see everything else differently. Every photograph, every statement, every fact was now viewed through the lens of those final words. It's remarkable how one moment can shift the balance so completely. The defense tried to dismiss the recording as irrelevant, even attempted to argue that it was unfairly emotional. But what they failed to realize was that truth doesn't become less true just because it stirs emotions. In fact, it is often emotion that makes truth undeniable. People in the gallery, ordinary citizens who had come to watch, spoke later about how they felt chills as the recording played. Some said it was like hearing a ghost. Others said it was like time itself had been rewound, giving the victim a final chance to speak when no one thought it possible. Whatever it was, no one forgot it. The message itself wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Sometimes it's not the number of words, but the weight they carry. "Don't believe the lies," the voice said. "I know what happened, and if anything should happen to me, I want the truth to be known." That line became more than evidence. It became a rallying cry for justice. From that point on, the trial was no longer about doubt. It was about confirmation. Every new piece of evidence seemed to fit perfectly with the words on the recording, like puzzle pieces falling into place. The picture became clearer, sharper, undeniable. The jurors began to watch the defendant closely. Small reactions, nervous movements, averted eyes, things that might have gone unnoticed before now stood out under the shadow of the recording. Because once truth is spoken, people become more attuned to seeing lies, and lies, no matter how carefully rehearsed, always leave cracks. The judge, too, recognized the significance. While remaining impartial, there was no way to ignore that the voice had changed the course of the trial. A voice from beyond had become the loudest testimony in the room, more commanding than any expert could ever be. And so the days that followed felt different. The outcome, which once seemed uncertain, began to lean heavily in one direction. The final goodbye had already tipped the scales. What remained was for the system to acknowledge it. But there was still one more moment to come, one last impact of that recording that no one expected. That final impact came when the jury returned to the courtroom after hours of deliberation. Everyone was tense, families on both sides, lawyers waiting, the defendants sitting rigidly at the table, and then the foreperson stood, holding the verdict. Guilty. The word echoed in the room like the answer to the voice that had spoken days earlier. Justice had found its way through the noise, guided by a recording that was never meant to reach this place. A goodbye had become a witness. A farewell had become evidence. And truth, once again, had done what truth always does. It revealed itself. The family wept quietly, not in celebration, but in relief. There was no joy in the outcome because no verdict could bring back the voice they loved. But there was peace in knowing that their loved one's final words had not been lost in the wind. They had mattered. They had carried weight. They had brought justice. The defendant sat motionless, eyes fixed on nothing, because there are moments when guilt, once exposed, leaves no place to hide. The trial was over, but the voice remained. A voice recorded in private, now immortalized in public memory. And as the court adjourned, people left the room with the same thought. Sometimes the most powerful evidence doesn't come from a document, a witness, or an expert. Sometimes it comes from the heart of the one who can no longer be present. A reminder that truth has a voice of its own, and it never truly dies. For you, the listener, there's something deeper here. Life is fragile, unpredictable. None of us know how much time we have, or when our final words might become the last thing people hear from us. So let those words matter. Speak truth. Speak love. Speak what needs to be said before silence takes its place. Because one day, what you leave behind may be the only voice that remains. This story reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, light finds a way. Truth can't be buried forever. And sometimes, the quietest voice carries the loudest message. If you found power in this story, if it made you think about the importance of words, then stay with us. Subscribe to our channel, not just to hear more stories like this, but to remind yourself every day of the strength hidden in the human spirit. We bring you stories that don't just entertain. They make you reflect, they make you feel, and they make you see life in a new way. And to you, watching this right now, remember, your voice matters, your truth matters. Use it while you can. Because one day, those words might be the very thing that changes everything.